The session.
Yeah. So in India, it's 7:30 p.m. Our guest is zooming in from 7 a.m., if I might mention a time zone. And I'm here in the afternoon in Brussels. So looking forward to the conversations. So while you are coming on board, do not hesitate to put in the chat box where you are coming from. I see that Melissa is coming from Kuala Lumpur. Welcome, Melissa. So it must be quite late for you. Thanks for being there. And while you are getting ready for this session, don't forget your drink. Sonia, what do you have for this evening?
A little bit boring. It's just pani. Just now.
Pani.
Yes,
water pani.
Yeah, to keep a clear head.
Great. Great to see we have also people from Bangalore. That's the good news.
Yes. We have Switzerland, we have Michigan, we have Delhi, we have Kuala Lumpur, we have Bhopal, Hyderabad.
Excellent. Oh, I see Rosina. She's from Brussels. Hi, yeah. Rosina.
Somebody else likes water. Good.
Great. So we'll begin in a few seconds. Welcome, everyone. And for those who are joining for the first time, Design Open Happy is already in its 7th episode. Time is flying, and we'll spend 1 hour together. And our guest is, as I mentioned, in another time zone. So he's coming and zooming in from Canada. But before introducing him, Design Open Happy was launched during this famous Corona COVID moment where Sonia and myself, we were thinking, how do we keep a spot for having light conversations while talking about the temperature of our planet from a designer point of view? And so here we are with Design Open Happy, and Design Open Happy is a kind of spin-off of Design Open. And Sonia, maybe you give us a few words on Design Open, and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Sure, thanks, Alok. So Design Open really was created as a space to be able to map emergence. Design's biggest opportunity and problem is that it's so open. And so open to interpretation. So you need to keep interpreting and reinterpreting it all the time. So it was launched as a series of physical interactive events attended by 8,000 people with about over 50 speakers. And then we found partners in Hyderabad and in Kochi to be able to take it to the design weeks there. And it was fascinating that on the Sundays, which it became the after party of the design weeks, and everybody felt that they must attend it, made new friends and had amazing conversations between, people who are leading big design organizations and systems and even students. So that's the beauty. It's an open platform to have these conversations. And happy happened because we felt that we need to continue these conversations despite circumstances.
Yeah, and we are lucky today to have our speaker zooming in from Canada, Johnathon Strebly. And Johnathon was attending one of our Design Open session in Kochi. So it's good to have you back virtually, and welcome, Johnathon. And you are based in Canada, and you have been busy with many organizations, you had many activities in different types of companies, associations, and there is a long list from the Creative Mornings in Vancouver to the graphic associations, and we'll travel within the different scapes you have been through, and it's good you can be with us. So for our attendees, for our audience who are here live, for you it's 7 a.m. and for us in Brussels it's the afternoon, and for those in India it's the evening. for Kuala Lumpur, it's late evening, so have your glass ready, and we'll jump into one meta question. We thought that to provoke ourselves and have a kind of wake-up shock for you, Johnathon, at 7 a.m. in the morning. Can design fix the future? We thought, okay, let's jump into that kind of meta question and see how we'll land and where we'll land.
That's great. Well, first of all, thank you, Alok and Sonia, for inviting me here. It's good to see you both again. It's unfortunate we can't be doing it in person at this time, but I know that we'll find ourselves together again somewhere in the world.
Yep.
And also thank you for recognizing when we look at our bios or our CVs or resumes, it starts to become this long laundry list of things that we've done and attended to. And I believe we're all in that same circle, and understanding that we have a professional contribution to make, but I believe that the professional contributions are actually validated and enhanced by the advocacy work that we all do, you know, and so I admire the work you two are doing beyond your own scope of professional careers, and looking at how we can extend this dialogue and then hopefully better our industry overall. The question of how can design fix the future? What a great question. You know, what a great question. I'd say that it's done a pretty good job of doing some poor things along the way. So I think as soon as we recognize that we have the power and the recognition of being complicit in some of the issues we've seen along the way, then we realize that that same power and opportunity exists on what we can do to course correct. And there's never been a greater time to see how involved we can be. And so if we look at the word fix, can design fix the future? Design can contribute to the repair and the innovation and the contribution of many aspects of bettering our communities and our world around us. Absolutely, it can contribute. I'd like to spend a little time on defining the word fix. And I think that is both an observational definition, but also a challenge to anybody listening, quite frankly, or in the industry, because if the idea to fix something is to go back to where you were, then I would question your thought process on that. You know, the idea that design fixes things by actually taking the time to step back, to look at what's there, to audit, to examine, to reference, resource, research, etc. And then to question, what do we need to continue to bring with us? So if we're going to use the context of our time now and look at the future, we can look back and go, wow, there's some amazing things we've done. Great, let's bring them along. And let's also be very aware of, wow, there's some things that we really shouldn't bring with us. Good, let's leave them packaged there and continue along. And the design process allows us to do that. The design process allows us to really question the value of any pieces that we're bringing along with us so that we can focus on the task at hand. And so, yes, design can fix the future if we know that we don't have to obligate ourselves to what was, and we allow ourselves that opportunity to question what we need, and then to find the way to get there based upon what we know and what we learned during that process.
Great. And what I would like to stress before giving the floor to Sonia for the next provocation is you are touching on a sweet spot where I think that policymakers and politicians need to open their eyes on. What would you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't want to point fingers at, you know, stakeholders and decision makers and policy makers for missing an opportunity, but we can. That would be the easy thing to do. It's like, well, if only you had, you should have, and that's hindsight. The value of design is recognizing that some of our greatest contributions are actually invisible. If we consider the system and service design capacities that we have and the results that we have, it's making lives easier. And when your life is easy, you don't actually see that there's a value to that per se. You know, you realize the value when it's taken away. And so when your question and that pointedness to politicians and policymakers about how can we assist them, and quite frankly, call them out for poor decisions for not including certain aspects of that process is vital, absolutely vital. And, you know, we as organizations and we as individuals have a certain obligation to ensure that our voices are heard. But I would suggest that policymakers and politicians aren't waiting for an individual voice to call them out. They're waiting for us to align ourselves and for us to organize ourselves and to come back as a unified force and a unified solution to then show them how we can help them. You know, the idea of like middle managing, so to speak, is that if we allow them to take something we've created to include in where they are, then they'll have an easier time of making it an inclusive process going forward. And I'll finish that by saying that, you know, when you finally do get a proponent or a lobbyist or someone proactive in a government that sees and realizes the value of design, that affecting the bottom line as well. I mean, there's the metrics of success we have to talk about. You know, there's a positive social impact metric, but there's also a bottom line financial metric. So policymakers are going to decide which one they're going to focus on. But ultimately, if it's the public that's demanding a certain resolution, or the public that is demanding a certain value be added, then we find ourselves being included in the conversation. Now, that's where I'm going to bring up this final point, is that too many times those stakeholders, and this is corporate as well as civic governments, is that they create a design advisory panel. And a design advisory panel, that's great. That's a door open, that's a step in. But I would like to see that inversed and say, why doesn't every single panel and committee have a designer on it? So it's the idea of like, it's not this outside thing that you filter things through. It's something you have in the very beginning stages, so you appreciate the process and how we can actually be more inclusive. The final result is always more valuable when you're involved with the beginning conversation.
Great.
Yeah, so to build on that, actually, we're in a time of disruption. Like, you know, we talk about disruption, but this is disruption, right? And there's emergence. There are things that we did not expect would come together, you know, and there's climate change, and there's the COVID crisis, there's what happened in Beirut. A lot of things are happening now, and they're all the result of bad decisions in the past, you know. And so do you think that design can play a role in being able to decode that emergence? You know, sort of be the factor, be the agent to help decode that emergence and then plan forward. So can design stop following its own linear process that we've set out for ourselves and help respond differently to what's happened? So can it sort of play a different role? And how can it help differently than what it has before?
Yeah, I mean, there's a powerful word there in the respect to emergence, you know, and emergence means that it's always been there. It just has this heightened sense of realization or impact at a certain point. So I'd like to describe it as, you know, pre-COVID, and COVID seems to be that one thing where suddenly there's this great equalizer of problem, of pain, of system failures, and we're all living that same difficulty. You know, we're all able to respond to it differently depending on where we are and who we are, of course. But globally, we're all understanding the same issue, more or less. And so I can't think of another time, at least in recent history, where pre-COVID, we were all kind of redlining in our RPM meter. You know, we were all in the red zone. We were buzz, 110%, and we had no room or capacity to see whether it's a passion project or a meaningful contribution or a community engagement effort or something that allowed us to just get in there and go, yes, let's do that. And if we did, something suffered, and we always carried that guilt or that weight. So then COVID arrives in addition, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's not just COVID, that's icing on a very terrible cake. If we look at all those layers that we are seeing converge, that's affecting us on our daily lives and our future generations. It's not just us today, it's everything from here to tomorrow. And that whole idea that when COVID hit, that RPM meter just went zoop, it just stopped. It's like somebody just pulled the plug out. And we thought, okay, well, wait a minute. Now we need to ramp ourselves back up. And I feel, and I hope that many of us do, if we're talking about the optimism factor here, if we're talking about how fortunate we are, that we remember being almost unable to do what we really are trained and capable of doing, and then suddenly nobody could do anything, and yet here we are coming back to this median. So now we have this sweet spot, as Alok had noted, that we are now able to give when those new things come aboard and have the bandwidth to accept that, address that, contribute to that. And also, if we feel ourselves sliding back to, wait a minute, we're not doing enough, we can kick ourselves in the butts and also help each other bring that back up. So your question around how do we address and understand the impact of emergence, the impact of these high stress points in our communities and cultures today, is to never forget. And I think that's one of the issues, is that from policymakers to professionals in most industries, we have a very short memory span where we start to forget the difficulties. We want to remove ourselves from past traumas, and we want to kind of gloss over that and just look ahead and chase the shinier objects. And I can't think, when we think about where we were, what happened, where we are, I can't think of any time, place, or system that would have allowed us the opportunity to actually design a process to get us back to this place of comfort. So there's a massive opportunity here for us to recognize that we remember this, where we were almost incapable to do what we're best at. And yet we could always remember the struggle and the difficulty, which still exists. And yet we now have more opportunity to address that and to remember that and carry that forward. And so that's an answer from a humanistic perspective, but that immediately is applicable and scalable to any design industry or design process.
Yeah.
Now, seeing the complexity, you used two interesting approaches, one which was this multi-layering of different stuff that Sonia and yourself have been alluding to, and the other one is your metaphor of the red light or RPM, where we are in the red zone. If we take this and we try to get into one pain point you mentioned, the short memory span, how are we going to work together? Because you alluded to the work together.
Mm.
And I would like us to think and you to give us some insights about this togetherness, or what we call often in our craft co-design, or what some other people in innovation call co-creation. And how can we build on that and have some insights from your experience or some cases you might have seen?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alok, and it's recognizing that we're not in this alone, or we're all in this together. And there's many adages in many regions, and as you and I both know, leading international organizations, is that we are able to have been privy to similar thought process shared from regional perspectives. And there's some global understandings, such as it takes a village. You know, it takes the entire community to contribute to the benefit of any one citizen. Yeah. And so my answer to that is to consider the design community and our sometimes factious or fractious approaches, where we're creating these silos, and the lack of communication between them starts to create these differences and upheavals. And I would suggest that, thankfully, I think we're seeing a change in that to the better. You know, we are now hearing and seeing terms such as multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, which is both internally challenging, because it's asking you to expand what you currently know so that you can be more aware of other practices and opportunities, but also opening that network of what else is available so that we can, I like the words, we collude to collide. So we are colluding to come together, and in that there's going to be these atoms bouncing off of each other, some difficulties, but through that, that's our challenge, you know. And once again, it's our practice of a design process that allows us to recognize the value points and the pain points, and to find a way through them all. And innovation is an interesting word, because, you know, I both appreciate it and challenge it, in that, you know, we as organizations and we as multidisciplinary approaches, we talk about innovation like it just happens, but innovation is actually a measure, you know, and innovation is only proven to be innovative after that life cycle of that product, service, system, or message has been through, and you can actually go to the end point of it and say, what were our metrics of success? Was it successful? Great. Now compare it to everything else. Was it innovative compared to everything else? But the idea that innovation happens at that beginning spark, it might be, but it can't be proven until later on. And we forget that that spark in the beginning, that's actually called design. That's actually the creative process in the beginning. That's what we do on a regular basis. So what I'm hearing from you is both a recognition that we need each other to be successful. Mm-hmm. And through that conversation and that widening of that communication and the recognizing the value of others' contributions, corporations are seeing that, governments are seeing that, because they're seeing that unification, they're seeing that convergence, they're seeing that value. And now it's being applied. Sometimes it's being not co-created, it's actually being co-opted, you know, where they're actually seeing something of value and they're bringing it on board. You know, I could argue that some methodologies and approaches and inclusions of design thinking is more about like the democratization of design and taking it as a buzzword and not really an inclusive professional process. You know, so there's many ways to touch on that. I might be going off on a bit of a tangent here, but your question is around, can we co-create and is there value in that? Any one of us as designers, and probably every single person listening right now, can say absolutely yes. The question is, how do we release that value beyond our silos to the stakeholders and decision makers and the policymakers so that it resonates and rings true and is sustainable and not just a project based, but actually policy and process and organizational inclusion?
Yeah. Sonia, before giving you the word, thanks, Jonathan, for bringing that. And to our attendees, we'll address the questions. And I see that Guillermina Mendoza is putting some interesting thoughts there in the chat box. And Siddharth Das, you are raising a question in the Q&A. So for all the others, do put your questions in the Q&A. And if it's in the chat box, we'll try to make sure that we address that. That is in terms of logistics. So let's not forget that. Yeah, Sonia.
So when you were talking about the collusion and the collision and the reaction, I was reminded of something you were saying the other day when we were discussing, and also of a term that we've been thinking about, this whole idea of reactment. So it's, you know, one is creative action, which is what design is supposed to do. But right now what we need is reaction. You know, we need to act again. And maybe in that acting again, we play the role of catalysts to be able to get everyone together, to be able to put it out there saying that this is what happened and, you know, we mustn't forget this. And these are some of the immediate shifts we need to make. This is what we can do long term. Maybe there and there, I'm reminded of the term, and if you can build on that a little bit, that you were speaking about the other day, that of co-opetition, which was a very interesting sort of thought. And if you can expand that a little bit, it'd be, I think everyone would enjoy that.
Yeah, I think that we're having some wordplay here right now, which is great. So I'm sure there's a bunch of people with their sketchbooks putting in some words and hopefully visualizing them they can share later. A lot of that stems from a conversation you and I had, Sonia, and something you said around responsibility. You know, when we talk about culpability and our own complicity in creating some of the issues, we're part of a process, we're part of those systems, which means that we're also part of systems that can benefit and grow. So we have an accountability and a responsibility to remember that for too long, designers have been servants of manufacturers and producers, when really our greatest role is to be the ambassador of the end user. Now, end user is kind of an ugly term. I like to use family, you know, our parents, our grandparents, our elders, back to Alok's question, like multidisciplinary, but I bring up multi-generational. Like our elders lived through a lot of those situations we're in right now, and many civilization systems were about referring back to the elders for advice, as opposed to youth for innovation, you know, so there's a combination there. And so I like your question around the word co-opetition, but it also resounds off of what your description of responsibility was, is that if we're asked to be responsible or practice responsibility, we need to have the ability to respond, you know, and I love that breakdown and that recognition. And co-opetition kind of is fostered from that. And that's something that came about with working with my colleagues and a number of opportunities where we're facilitating conversation and dialogue. And it resounds off the question of when you're talking to somebody and you're getting somewhere, like today, right here, right now. And when we're able to grow what we know, and it's through being challenged, it's through being seeing someone else maybe do something better than us, and that's how we get better, is by bringing those on board that are seeing something better. And then once we've had that conversation with them, is asking the question, who else should I be talking to? You know, and that's where that can be an individual, that can be a discipline, that can be a policymaker, that can be a government leader. But when you finally have an ear and there's a dialogue, is to ask the question, who else should I be talking to, and carry that forward. And that's where co-opetition comes in, because some of the most valuable conversations we're going to have are actually with those that we sometimes feel threatened by, or sometimes that we admire from a distance. But if we're going to talk about the communication design, well, let's talk about communication so that we can all be better designers and have a better design industry.
I love that. I can almost see, I love that the value of conversation, and even tough conversations you're saying, is about, it's almost like a forest. I almost saw a forest, you know, where you plant the seeds of new ideas and then they grow into something new. I love that, because there will be conflict there, you know, but then there will be sharing and growing.
Well, I'll layer onto that, Sonia. That's a good point. Is that if it were easy, everybody would already be doing it.
Yes.
You know, we have to recognize that everything we do should have a challenge, because that means we're finally getting to a pain point and addressing an issue, and so that's actually something to celebrate. You know, when we talk about the optimism and the positive contribution we have, it's by asking tough questions and addressing tough issues.
So then, sorry, Alok, you go on, because I wanted to ask him the graphic design. It's a divergent question from what we've been discussing. So if you want to add anything, Alok, before that.
Before diverging, on one side, we talked about co-creation. On the other side, we talked about co-petition. And now, Sonia, in order to diverge, let me give you a trigger. Johnathon, back in your room, there is this fantastic poster.
Mm.
And because I want to situate our conversation, I'm taking that poster, and maybe you can give us some insights on that, and then Sonia can jump into her divergent question.
Yeah. Well, it might even be bringing up that idea of graphic design. So the poster behind me is actually an event poster. I'm past president of an organization in Canada called the Graphic Designers of Canada. So it's an over 60-year-old organization, which doesn't sound like a lot of time for many parts of the world, but for Canada, that's a long time. And this particular poster was designed by the designer Michael Mabry, and who was a speaker at an event which this poster he designed, and that was in 1993. So the idea of the thought process and visualizing our thinking, and when you go through it, you're seeing all these observations of both the meta and the micro, where he talks about the coffee order he made that morning and what he saw on the street as he was walking by, and then collected into this larger thinking about how we're going to change the world through design approaches and creative process. And so it's a nice reminder that there's a certain explosiveness to what we do in conceptual stages. I mean, there's a reason why it's called brainstorming, you know, so there's a lot happening there. But it's also a reminder that collectively it can all be contained, and bring it back down and say, okay, we have a solution that's here to be made. And also always asking others, what do they think? And having them actually come back and go, you know, that's a tough one. And so you see this honesty and transparency, and sometimes even naivete at all levels, you know, and that's where we humanize our process.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. I'm a graphic designer, and I once made a poster a bit like that, where there was this head which was opened up, and the guy was cooking in his own head. And because the guy who was taking a particular workshop, his name was Monge. And Monge sounds like a pulse, like an Indian dal, you know. So I wanted to make it like, you know, he'll help you cook what's going on in your own head. So my graphic design question, therefore, and of course, I studied graphic design, but then I've gone on to do all kinds of work in strategy, etc., etc. But my roots are there. And so my question to you, since you're connected with and so closely associated with this space, is does graphic design sometimes limit itself and what it can be? And in today's day and age, can the whole idea of communication, behavior change, etc., all the changes we need, can it play a stronger role as an integrative discipline? It brings
Yeah,
together ideas, it brings together the graphics and the type, and can it play a more powerful role? What do you think about the role and the space of graphic design?
well, graphic design has a long and storied history under the term design, and we see that, and we've seen many, many wonderful examples of that, and pioneers that we've even lost recently. Like we think of like Milton Glaser, just a phenomenal example of someone who recognized and used the power of graphic design. And graphic design can be limiting, but the past understandings of its limitations are very different than today's appreciations for how we need to be doing more. And graphic design has now become part of a larger discipline, or starts to change into multiple disciplines, because graphic design has that history of us cutting our fingers with X-Acto knives, creating layouts and photo transfers and cutting Rubylith. But how does that translate into the digital environment? And how powerful are graphics in the digital environment? How long is the attention span today in the digital environment versus looking at a poster? So we have very different approaches. So then the term communication comes in. And I believe that the principles and the foundations of getting a message or talking about a service or a product has always been the impetus of the need of graphic design. And so those needs of product, service, and message haven't changed, but our disciplines to achieve that have increased in opportunity and increased in mediums and platforms. So the word communication comes in handy for that, but then there's those multiple disciplines and multiple approaches. And I think people don't want to be typecast anymore. And they certainly don't want to be labeled with something which can be seen as anachronistic or dated. We always want to be on the cusp of new. It brings up the conversation multidiscipline, but also brings up the conversation of recognizing accessibility, inclusivity and diversity. Because when we had a recent conversation in some of our policy reviews, is that graphic design, should it be categorized as visual design? And that's a great question. So, or is it communication design? So where does all that sit? Because if you're doing wayfinding for an airport, there's a graphic component to that. But if the person going to the airport is sight impaired, what value is there in graphic design anymore? So now it's about communication design, and how do we communicate to those that have any kind of barrier to achieving the same objective that we should all have access to? So to me, that's the larger conversation. It's less about the value of graphic design so much as what we learned in that and what we continue to learn in that, and how can we adapt and apply it and question its impact and question its ability to serve as many people as possible. And so that is where we have a much larger and more important conversation. And so we can't just add the word diversity and inclusivity without actually recognizing that diversity is having a long list of representation and feedback, but inclusivity is actually making them part of that larger process and giving them a larger voice, not even them, like giving everyone equal opportunity to speak. That's inclusivity. And then we can talk about accessibility, where it's no longer something added onto the process, but is truly part of the original thinking. So I love your analogy. Open up the mind, never mind this closed silo and like smash open the light bulb, open up the head, mix it all up, and be prepared for new ingredients to come in, because the end result might be better.
Thank you. That's a great way of describing it, because you normally have these words floating about, but you don't know how to put it all together. So I like the way you've captured it all together. Thank you. Alok, should we take the questions?
Yeah, it allows us to jump into the Q&A, and I'll request all the attendees to just pour in their questions. I see one in the chat box where it's Sushena who's telling, don't you think we must address, can design fix the present before we move to the future? So we are looping back to our initial part of the conversation, but I think our provocation is interesting for us to rethink some of the stuff we have been talking about. What would be your take on that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I heard was the question was, shouldn't we spend time fixing the present as opposed to the future? And
or before we move to the future.
Before we move to the future, yeah. And I'd say, I would split that up and say, should we address today and should we address tomorrow? And the answer is yes. And so what I think that is being pointed out here, which is really important, is that everyone is talking about vision, but right now we're talking about strategy and strategy versus responsiveness. So if all we're doing is reacting to things happening today, we might be putting on short-term solutions for something which could actually impact the future negatively. And so if we're going to set up things right now to address COVID, like if we're making a whole bunch of plastic pieces to help with masks, are we creating a larger pool of plastic things into our environment that are going to be damaging in the future? So short-term, reactive, yes, we have to do it because we are in scenarios and situations. So let's fix that present. But that's a response and a reactive measure. And then there's the long-term. And then there's the strategic approach to how does that fit the strategy? The question is, in our vision of a better future and the strategic plan to get there, are we able to include that strategic plan while we're responding to these emergent issues, continued issues, these spikes in problems as we approach along the way? And if we can't address that, if we're not addressing that, then there's probably a problem with our system, is that we need to build in that ability to respond quickly and with confidence and success. And we've seen failures in that in many, many examples, but we've also seen some incredible opportunities arise from issues that have been addressed quite well because of systemic design approaches early on in that strategy. I went off on a tangent there. The question was, shouldn't we address today's issues before jumping into the future? I'd say both are happening simultaneously. And the more we are cognizant of thinking about the effect of what we're doing today, tomorrow, then we're actually doing a better job of understanding and reminding ourselves of sustainability, the life cycle of a product, and the half-life of any components or materials we're using along the way.
Great, and to jump on another question by V. Chandra, he's asking, to fix, you need tools. What would be those tools? So the question to you would be, can you share with us some examples of tools that would give interesting insights to some of our attendees?
Wow, what a great question. And so we talked about, like, how do we define the word fix? And then you can define the toolkit necessary in order to achieve that objective. It's a great question because obviously it's specific and it'll be bespoke to any particular scenario, but I would suggest that the greatest tool we have is that conceptual thinking and to remind ourselves to not be dependent upon a particular technology or platform or medium. I believe that is a part of our process where we actually resolve ourselves to understanding innovative moments and moments of invention. So let me just expand on that, because if you only go to the tools you currently have, you can only repair so much. But if the current problem you have is requiring a new tool to be created for it, well, that's the creative process. And that's the opportunity. So there's a line I use that says that if you only do what you know, you can never grow. And so if you only accept jobs that you know how to do, you'll never be able to expand what you know and what you know how to do, and also expand your toolkit. So the toolkit, for me, the first tool is what you imagine is, if I were to use a metaphor of the toolbox, the first tool is your mind. What do you imagine is actually inside that toolbox? And imagine what you actually need versus opening that up and being dependent upon what already exists. because you might not have to go to your toolbox. You might actually have to go to the store to find something new or invent your own. And that is where we as a design industry actually innovate, actually invent, actually create, and co-create through a shared problem is something that we as a community and design community can help each other do.
Great, great. You are, in a way, my takeaway of that, and I hope that the attendees are in sync with us, is that we as designers, we should love abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
And by mastering abstraction, we are agnostic of tools. Would that make sense if I react like that to your point?
To add to what you're both saying, it's also meditativeness. You know, I mean, we say all the answers are within you. If you've searched yourself, all the answers are there, but have you made that effort to search yourself? You've been granted that pause. So, you know, to explore within is I think, a very, very important tool itself.
Yeah, I think that is very correct. I would say yes, and then I would add a layer of hard practicality. And that is that one of the greatest tools is recognizing that you're not the right person to be fixing that particular part. Is that if you go to your toolkit and you're trying to address something, so one of those greatest tools is understanding that there's other people, other professionals with their own toolkits that can help us. And that's where we stop thinking that we are the savior, like destroying savior complex, destroying this idea that only one designer or one agency or one region can fix a problem is problematic. And so to think on that, to really understand and to, yes, look inside and say, well, what is it of value I can bring? And then who else do we need to bring in to make this better? And that goes back to Alok's question about multidisciplinary and that co-creation. Is we are going to be far better off when we're able to actually say, you know what, I don't know, but I trust in my process that together we'll find that solution together, and that's powerful. That's probably the most powerful tool we have in our toolkit.
Great. Now you talked about practicality, so let's go to a question by Hemang Angle, and he's asking a very, I would argue, a very practical question. Pandemic is contributing to increase the value of visual communication, which is online and digital. But what about the future of medias in print communication?
Is there a future in print, or are we're seeing the value of, yeah.
Let's try to dig into that one, because I guess, I don't know you, Sonia, or you, Johnathon, but I'm a lover of books and paper. And for me, there is always a future in printed, but I'm curious to have your views.
Well, I think that let's talk about technology and how we as humans actually adapt to it and adopt it. And are we successful in that adoption? You know, some people move faster to technologies and other mediums and platforms, and some will reside within an area of comfort and where you're actually able to go forward. So let me reframe that and say that, you know, the internet is available. Why do we need professions at all? All the answers are there. But we as professionals and as certain industries are doing a really good job of acting as curator of this massive library of information. So we're actually able to navigate and guide people to certain thinkings and certain methodologies and certain processes that have a history of success while moving forward from that. The question around with digital technologies and digital platforms, does print still have a place? Absolutely, but the ratio is going to change, and we're going to see a change along the way. I have never bought more books or more vinyl records than today. You know, when we think about when LPs were turning into CDs, turning into digital files, and then suddenly I've got so many digital files, I don't even know what music I have. Or when books were on your bedside or on your desk, and then you tore into that, and then suddenly you get a Kindle and you're adding multiple books, and suddenly you have so many books you forgot what you were even reading. I think there's a certain break point in human nature and human adaptation and human acceptance where technology is just too much. And then the onus of that is that we step away from it and we just forget that there's actually a resource and a source that we can go to. So I don't think that's answering your question so much as my own personal feeling that we get to a certain point and then we struggle and strive and need something tactile. And I'm going to add to that. That's not just things, because we're consumers. We're excellent at being consumers, and we're really good at overconsumption. We need to be cognizant of that. But let's start to find a way to fix the issues we have so we can go back to over-consuming tactile touch and feel and sharing, and the value of a library of hugs that I don't currently have, because we're in this place where physical contact is suddenly an issue. And that human need, that human interaction with everything we have around us. And once we remind ourselves of that, of what's missing, and once we remind ourselves of what we've loved and has now been taken away from us, then we'll actually start to question higher, what value is digital technology if it can't replace that deep-seated need that we as human beings have, that we can actually share.
When you can't travel, you can travel through your taste buds.
I love that.
And so you cook exotic meals and you have that. Similarly, I mean, yeah, digital makes it's so transactional. You want something and you find it. It's so transactional. It's not the same as reading one of the Latin American writers and, the magic realism and getting lost in a book. I've never been lost on Kindle, or even in on Netflix. I mean, when you have episode after episode and they're hanging on to you, they keep you hanging in some way. It's not the same with the book. The relationship is very different with the print medium. The feel is very different. Literally, the feel is very different. So
I really like that, because you touched on two things. One is that visual connection to something, where the book, where you're reading those words, and then if you close your eyes, you imagine that space. So it's transcending. You're taken somewhere else. And then there's that olfactory response and the idea of dining and being taken somewhere else, and that could be from memory or brand new. Okay. And that goes back to the idea of accessibility and inclusivity once again, is because if we're only allowing ourselves one tool, let's say a visual connection to something, then there's so many missed opportunities of how we can expand that experience. I love that you bring up food. To me, food and food safety and access to nutrition is huge, and it's a barrier that no one should have. And it's also potentially one of the easiest problems we have to solve in the world, but we're not collectively doing it yet. And I hope that we can get there. And I've always said that, having a great meal and a great dinner doesn't mean it's an expensive meal. It just means it's a great meal and a great dinner. I've always said it's the cheapest holiday you can ever take. For an hour or 2 or 3, you can be taken somewhere else completely, and then you can be brought back. And yeah, we went from, is print design still valuable, to let's go have a good meal together. But that's also at the table. At the table is where some of the greatest dialogue happens too, where when you're sated with good food and good drink and good conversation, that's where so many of the greatest things that we have today actually were fostered and convened and brought together. And so we're recreating pieces of that here right now as best we can with the conditions we're all in. And to your point earlier, no, we're not traveling, and most of us travel regularly for our work and our organizations, and now that's been removed. And I always say that, I may not be traveling as much as I did before, but I certainly have the same jet lag I did before. Meetings at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. add up quick.
Yeah, so that's called Zoom lag now. So, we didn't touch upon a complex and rich territory, which is education. And there is a question there where Monotosh is asking, how do you think design can positively contribute towards shaping up the entire ecosystem of a child's education? It's a big chapter, but maybe if you can share with us some insights.
Yeah, and it's a great question to be asking, because there's a whole new look at education right now, because it's not just from the institutions that have been providing education, but now at home. With many people at home and looking at ways to teach and learn while they're at home for their own safety and their own well-being is another approach to it. Through the International Council of Design, we're a large organization, international organization with 3 member areas. That's professional, educational, and promotional. And we've been holding meetings with our members in each of these categories and some crossover, but it's speaking with our educational members where we're starting to hear similar issues, a shared frustration, but also a shared optimism for the opportunities that are being presented and those challenges that come together. And so education has many touch points, and I'm not sure what the question was directing itself towards, but if we understand that we will always be better as long as we're continuing to learn and then sharing that as we go back. So what I'll say is that with education, I look at us as industry people, and which I'm considering the majority of those listening and those educational leaders or organizational leaders that are listening as well, is that there's an obligation on us to, wherever we are and however we got there, our obligation is to send the elevator back down so we can continue bringing people up. And so the idea of education, I'm going to summarize very quickly in this 3-stage education that I fall into for lifelong learning ideas. And that is that if I'm your teacher and you're my student, I'm going to give you everything I know. Now, everything I know is in my context and through my experiences. So I'm sharing that with you, and not all of it will be understood or resolved because there's a contextual piece that's missing. And so retention comes into play as well. But after I've given you everything I know, that second third is the student taking it into their context and their experience and their environments and having that grow and change into something else. The final third is that student coming back and being the teacher and the teacher being the student. And so that shared experience come back. And so that cycle of mentoring and protege and assisting and leading and co-leading and co-opetition is how we actually become better. So if we're not asking the tough questions and the right questions, then we're not actually enhancing our own knowledge and understanding. And then we need to bring that into our current academic and educational structures, which exist in many of them really well, and to continue to ask those tough questions and find new solutions to provide access to that education.
Great. So I hope it answers the question Monotosh was asking, because his view was looking at the entire ecosystem of a child's education, but you are touching at that ecosystem view with your personal experience. So that's, I think, interesting for...
Yeah. I have no experience that I could refer to for the child education other than community approaches. And so I actually go back to what I said before and say that, we have an obligation to be asking our elders and taking a multi-generational approach. And a child's education is one of those first precepts and applications of multi-generational teaching. And then suddenly we kind of stop that to a certain degree where it's peer-to-peer, and we've kind of lost that multi-generational approach. So that life cycle of a child's education is, once again, vision, strategy, and implementation. So we're seeing that come through. But the idea of awakening the child's mind, or even the Zen philosophy of the child's mind, where you're open to making mistakes, to thinking you're invincible, where you run like crazy, even though you don't have the biomechanics to run perfectly, and you fall and you trip and you scrape your chin and you laugh about it, you get up and you keep going, and then suddenly we find ourselves as adults forgetting that that's okay, and making sure that everything's perfect and form is perfect and everything is over perfect. And we miss that opportunity to smile and that opportunity to just glow with the experience, and then to take that forward as an energy that we can be turning into solutions.
Great. You know what? Only 6 minutes left before the hour is off. So this happy hour goes so quickly. What we'll try to do is to take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll slowly land after this hour together. Sonia, you want to jump in?
I want to look at Siddharth's question about putting down some basic tenets of design practice, much like you just talked about education. Going forward into the future, I like the fact that you talked about being open, and maybe, for instance, just having conversations like this to figure out the way forward is one of the things we need to do. But what could be those basic tenets of design practice?
Well, the basic tenets of design practice is understanding what the actual opportunity is. You know, if we're going to take the design open happy concept and that approach to it, is that too many times we're constantly saying we're trying to fix a problem. But actually every problem is an opportunity if you just reframe it slightly and say, okay, well, now how do we look at that problem today and what the opportunity is for positive impact and positive success into the future? And so that as a basic tenet, in addition to the other layer, and that is to stop thinking about ourselves and stop thinking about how we benefit at this point, and really start thinking about our children and our children's children, and some of those what's sometimes considered ancient philosophies, but they're applicable today. And that is in some indigenous cultures, it's about the 7 generations, about you thinking about not today and not tomorrow, not even your grandkids, but what would that decision be like for 7 generations? And how do we really consider the well-being and health of all of those far into the future so that they can be better for their 7 generations ahead? And too many times we're thinking about the immediacy, we're thinking about the instant gain, the instant celebrity, the instant profit. And I think we have all seen that that is not sustainable, and it is not conducive to the betterment of our world around us and our communities. So basic tenets would be stop thinking about ourselves and really start thinking about those that we should be serving and need to serve.
I think we have done a fascinating journey here in an hour, because the question could be reframed as, can we fix for the next 7 generations? And that is for me an interesting provocation in all our design decisions, actions, explorations. And I see that Thomas was the first speaker on the series. Thomas is there. He's also based in Canada. So hi,
hello,
Thomas.
Canadian. Hey, Thomas.
It's good to see your comment about intergenerational learning, because one of the insights that we are taking out of this conversation on this episode number 7 is the importance of this intergenerational knowledge, and I love that. So
and it's not new, you know, that we have to keep reminding ourselves, like some of the best answers we have already exist. So if there's emergence of issues, I hope for an emergence of solutions that are percolating underneath that already exist, that we need to give more power back to.
Yeah, great. 1 minute left and we have to land. So thanks, Johnathon, for sharing your insights. Thanks to the attendees for spending time with us. And this was also streamed on YouTube. This has been recorded. So for those of you who want to review that or share with your students, you have all this material at your disposal. And Sonia will have to close here by not only thanking Johnathon, but also announcing the next speaker. So shall I do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Going to do?
No, you do it.
Great. So just for our attendees, with Johnathon, we were on episode 7, and we have decided with Sonia and the Design Open Happy team that it's time to close this season of Design Open Happy. And the next one will be another fascinating speaker. He's based in Nairobi, Kenya. And his name is Mugendi Mrita. And Mugendi was, amongst other, the past president of WDO, another sister organization, World Design Organization. And Mugendi will bring to us stories which will resonate with another of our speaker, Parminder Veer, which is what I call Africa with a K. And Africa is such an immense territory where design has so many fascinating questions to go through. And Mugendi will bring to us his 20, 30 plus years of experience as industrial designer, as educator, as president, as past president of WDO, as senator. So this will come, I'm sure, in resonance with so many of the conversations we had so far in the different Design Open Happy episodes. So looking forward to seeing you all in 15 days. And thanks, Johnathon. Thanks to the Design Open Happy team, Sumet, Sudai, and all the team members who are making sure that it's recorded, technique is going smooth, audio is coming at the right place. And thank you, Sonia, for co-hosting this with me.
You're welcome.
Bye.
It's wonderful to see Thomas here, and the fact that we started from him talking about identity capital and all the insights that we picked up from every speaker. And I think Alok is pushing us to capture it all and share with you. So I think all of it will be available soon. And I think he'll also ask you to join our community. Maybe you can tell him a little bit about that. Yeah.
So we have designopen.in, and next to Design Open, you need to see Design Open as a, what we call, Sonia and myself, as a live magazine decoding emergence. And that is what we have been talking with you, Johnathon. And designopen.in has got its LinkedIn group, its Facebook group. So join us there. You'll find the links on designopen.in, and we can continue the conversations. So for those of you who have not seen their questions answered, do repost them on the Facebook group or the LinkedIn group. And I'm sure that with Johnathon and some others, we'll find a way to continue the conversation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Johnathon. Thank you, Sonia. And hi to all our attendees. Have a nice day, evening, afternoon, or night, depending on where you are on the planet.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Alok.
Thank you.
Thank you.